The mobility inequalities are the primary one before gender or race or class. And I actually say that gendered differences and racial differences are partly produced by control over mobilities. So, for example, when I take a plane, I might get a car service that picks me up at my house and takes me to the airport, and I have a privileged past traveler, rating from my airline, and I get in a nicer seat and I sit down sooner, and all of these parts of the trip on the journey. And then I might arrive somewhere and there's a taxi driver who picks me up. Now, maybe that taxi driver is an immigrant from another country and doesn't have citizenship. Maybe they had to get up at 3 in the morning and start driving their taxi at 4 a.m. and they're driving it 16 hours a day. Maybe they're separated from their family. So we're both very mobile, but we had completely different experiences of mobility, even though we were in the same place at the same time. So race is actually a product of mobility system, and gender is marked by mobility systems. And the same with class. Many class differences are created by differential mobilities. There's a high proportion of car crashes in the United States in which the victims are disproportionately people of color. That is what we say, Black, Hispanic, Native American people, because they've been excluded from the safe, convenient, good transportation systems. Many cultures divided male and female spatial areas, and they confined women to certain indoor areas, for example, or they had different things that women did and men did. And those decisions about the mobilities based on a binary gender system partly shaped the binary gender system. I grew up in the 1970s when there were the Take Back the Night rallies and movements for women to be able to go out safely at night and not feel threatened and unsafe. So those are all gendered dimensions of mobility injustice. The idea of a mobility regime is that these are not just individual choices. It's not just somebody's decision to move one way or another. Like they say, oh, well, just ride a bike. You don't have to drive a car. Instead, these things are built into the world. You can think of mobility regimes in different ways. I mean, a really obvious one, of course, is passports and visas. There's clearly, to everyone's, perception, a regime that controls who can cross a border, when and how, and under what conditions. But there's other smaller mobility regimes about just crossing a street, or how a staircase actually prevents somebody in a wheelchair from being to access a building. That's a mobility regime also that's just built into the architecture. When I think about mobility, I don't just think about moving from point A to point B, like transportation. I think about mobility as a way that we move across different scales, and people move, but also things move, goods move, culture moves, ideas move. And so mobility is actually a bigger system. It's not just about the transportation. One of the exciting things about the new mobilities paradigm is it lets us study different phenomena in the world. So you can look at it in terms of transportation systems. You can look at tourism and business travel. You can look at migration and citizenship regimes, and also mobile media and communication. I always begin from the colonial era and the mobility of the arrival of European colonizers had a huge effect of displacement of indigenous peoples. And that displacement is still the basis of all of our cities and our settlements and our inhabitations all across the Americas. That has continued over generations and still shapes the kinds of neighborhoods people live in today, the access they have to all kinds of public goods. And so that colonial history is part of the mobility injustices today. I often think about the world we live in today as a world that was built in partly, as I said, from colonial histories, but partly in the 20th century creation of the system of automobility. And that system is based on fossil fuel extraction. And the 20th century was the kind of fossil fuel century, the oil century, and we are experiencing the effects of that today. So in terms of climate change, we know that, yes, fossil fuel, the burning of fossil fuel has caused global warming, but also today that transportation is becoming the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases because there's so much transportation, there's so much use of fossil fuels for transportation, it's become the number one contributor. And at the same time, our cities and our regions have been built around these vehicles, fossil fuel systems. So when we look at contemporary political events, wars, for example, a lot of what we're seeing now is the desperate fight of the fossil fuel system to maintain its power in the face of the sustainability transition that is trying to push us towards electrification, decarbonization. In the 1990s was the period of course, the rise of globalization. And yes, there was globalization, but there were these huge inequities in who was able to move, and also like that businesses and investments were able to move very easily, but labor and workers were not able to move. And so we wanted to bring a focus on the power and inequalities into thinking about globalization and this new mobile world. I personally think that there are groups in the world who I call the kinetic elite, the elite global mobile people who are consuming the most resources in terms of energy and consuming the most mobility and doing it by choice, going on luxury vacations and having multiple homes. And I do think there's a responsibility of the kinetic elites and also the corporations that have created fossil fuel-based systems to owe a sort of climate debt, to owe back to societies and to not just their own place, but to the whole world, some kind of repayment of what is sometimes referred to as loss and damages or climate reparations. It can look really hard to tackle problems like car systems or over-tourism or migration concerns. All of these are big, big problems. At the same time, we know that these things have changed. If you look at it in long historical perspective, right, we know that cars were not always there. And we know that when cars first arrived, people fought against them. People didn't want cars in their cities. So these things are made by people. They're made by performances and practices and decisions that we make, which means we can unmake them. Now, is it harder to unmake things like one at a time, where you try to fix the transport system and you try to fix the tourism system and you try to fix migration and borders? Or is it better to try to offer a vision, an alternative vision that says we can live differently? We made this world, we can remake it. What vision do we have of how we might like to live? And once we have that understanding of where we're heading, where we want to live, how we want to live, all of those things will change with it. We'll move around differently, we'll live differently, we'll travel differently because we have some alternative vision. After about, 25 years of working on this topic, I started to think about the idea of commoning, not just a commons as a place, but commoning as an action. And I talk about mobile commoning as a way to think about how could we relate to others, both humans and more than humans, plants and animals and water and rivers and the atmosphere. How could we think about it through a commoning lens, which means that we take more care in our actions, that we maybe limit the impact of our movement and our mobilities on others. And what would it mean to have more shared spaces and more shared mobilities? And of course, we see that implemented in urban planning and especially in Barcelona, where you've tried to create shared urban spaces. We're at the end of a run of a certain kind of culture of excess consumption and excess use of energy, and we're reaching planetary limits. And so I don't see it able to continue. I think we're in this moment of excess and the last hurrah at the party, but it will end. And then we will all sober up, face reality, and say, we've got to swing back in another direction. We've got to reach a more sober period of time. There's a French movement called frugality heureuse, happy frugality. I think that kind of a thing will be coming into play more, and it exists already.